A man who had sworn off violence broke his vow for a stranger. He faced down mercenaries to save a Comanche woman from being dragged to her death. But when he looked at her face, his world shattered. It was the face of his wife, the woman he buried 2 years ago. He'd saved a life, only to come face to face with a ghost he couldn't explain and a past he couldn't escape. Where are you watching from today, friend? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in second chances, do consider subscribing to our channel for more stories from the heart of the West. Now, settle in. The desert wind is starting to blow. The town of Redemption was a blister on the face of the desert, a place where hope came to die. Dust, fine as ground bone, coated everything, the sagging porches, the thirsty horses at the trough, and the soul of Caleb Thorne. He sat on the porch of the mercantile, his back against the sun-warped wood, trying to ignore the ghosts that danced in the heat haze. It had been 2 years since he'd buried his wife, Ilara, and with her, he'd buried his guns and his rage. He was a rancher now, a man of peace, a promise made to a gravestone, a promise he intended to keep. But peace was a fragile thing in Redemption. The rumble of a heavy wagon and the crack of a whip pulled him from his reverie. It wasn't a supply wagon. This one was flanked by 4 hard-faced men on horseback, mercenaries by the look of their mismatched gear and cold eyes. They worked for a man named Silas Kane, a predator who bought and sold lives like cattle futures. But it was the cargo that made Caleb's blood run cold. Tied to the back of the wagon, half dragged, half stumbling, was a woman. Her wrists were bound to the tailgate, the rope raw against her skin. She was Native American, Comanche from the intricate beadwork on her tattered buckskin dress. A thick gag silenced her, and a dirty burlap sack covered her head. But her defiance was plain in the way she fought to keep her feet, even as the rough road tore at her moccasins. The townsfolk watched, some with pity, most with the weary indifference of people who knew better than to interfere with Silas Kane's business. They turned away, pretending to inspect wares or check their saddles. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. The vow he'd made to Ilara screamed in his mind. No more violence, no more death. He had seen enough to last a lifetime. He was a healer of horses and a mender of fences now, not a gunfighter. He squeezed his eyes shut, the image of Ilara's gentle face rising in his memory. She would have wanted him to stay out of it. She would have wanted him to be safe. But then another image followed. Ilara, in her final moments, her eyes begging him not to let bitterness consume him. Be a good man. Caleb. His eyes snapped open. The wagon rumbled past, the woman stumbling, her breath coming in ragged, muffled gasps. He saw the raw, bleeding skin on her wrists. He saw the casual cruelty in the laughter of the mercenaries. And in that moment, the vow he had made at a grave felt less like a promise and more like a cage. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. The dust swirled around his worn boots as he stepped off the porch and into the middle of the street. "Hold up," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. It wasn't a shout, but it carried the weight of command. The lead rider, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, reined in his horse, a sneer twisting his lips. "You got business with us, rancher?" "My business is with your cargo," Caleb said, his gaze fixed on the woman. "Let her go." The mercenaries erupted in laughter. "This ain't your concern," the scarred man snarled. "This is property of Mr. Kane. Now get out of the road before you get hurt." Caleb didn't move. He just stood there, a mountain of quiet resolve. He saw the flicker of uncertainty in the rider's eyes. They knew of him. They knew of the man he used to be. The man who'd put 6 members of the Black Creek Gang in the ground in as many seconds. The reputation was a ghost he couldn't shake, and for the first time in 2 years, he was grateful for it. "I'm not asking again," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. The scarred man's hand drifted toward his pistol. It was a foolish, telegraphed move. In a blur of motion, Caleb had only allowed himself in nightmares. He closed the distance. He seized the man's wrist, twisting it until bone grated. A cry of pain tore from the man's throat as his gun clattered into the dust. Caleb slammed the man's head against the horn of his own saddle, and he slumped over, unconscious. The other 3 were stunned into inaction for a half-second too long. Caleb was already moving, using the downed man's horse as a shield. He grabbed the rider's rifle from its scabbard, the familiar weight of the polished wood and cold steel, a phantom limb he'd forgotten he possessed. He levered around into the chamber, the sound echoing with terrifying finality in the silent street. He didn't aim at the men. He aimed at the thick rope binding the woman to the wagon. The shot cracked, and the rope snapped. The woman stumbled forward, catching herself before she fell. "That's enough!" Caleb's voice was the roar of a man who had held back a storm for too long. "Ride out, now, or the next one goes through an engine block you can't replace." He stared them down, his eyes promising a violence he had sworn to forsake. The remaining mercenaries exchanged a look. They were paid to be cruel, not suicidal. Muttering curses, they grabbed the reins of their unconscious partner's horse and spurred their mounts, galloping out of town in a cloud of vengeful dust. The street was silent again, save for the panting of the woman. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, the adrenaline a sickening, familiar poison. He had broken his vow. He dropped the rifle as if it were burning him and walked slowly toward her. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer now. "You're safe." He reached for the burlap sack over her head. She flinched but held her ground. He gently lifted it off. Her hair, black as a raven's wing, was matted with dust and sweat. He then reached for the gag, his fingers fumbling with the knot. The rough cloth fell away, and Caleb Thorne's world stopped turning. He was staring into the face of his dead wife. The same high cheekbones, the same defiant chin, the same full lips. But it was the eyes that shattered him. They were the color of warm whiskey, flecked with gold, and filled with a fire he hadn't seen since he'd closed Ilara's for the last time. He stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping his lips. It was impossible, a trick of the sun, of the grief that still clung to him like a shroud. But she was real. The rise and fall of her chest, the pulse beating in her throat, the cautious fear in those identical eyes. He was frozen, not by the threat of violence, but by the ghost standing before him. The silence stretched, thin and taut like a wire. For Caleb, the dusty street of redemption dissolved into a swirling vortex of memory. He saw Ilara, laughing as she braided a horse's mane. He saw her tending the small garden she'd insisted on planting in the unforgiving soil. He saw her dying. Her eyes, those same eyes, fading as her hand grew cold in his. The woman before him blinked, the motion pulling him violently back to the present. She was not Ilara. Ilara was gone. This woman was Comanche, her features honed by a different sun, her skin a warmer, deeper bronze. Yet the resemblance was so profound, it felt like a deliberate cruelty from God himself. Who are you?" Caleb finally managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. She watched him, her expression shifting from fear to a guarded curiosity. She rubbed her raw wrists, her gaze never leaving his. She seemed to understand that the source of his shock was not her, but something within him she had unknowingly unleashed. "They call me Adsila," she said. Her voice was lower than Ilara's, with a husky, resonant quality, like stones rolling in a deep riverbed. Adsila. The name was foreign. yet it came from lips so familiar it made his heart ache. He had to get them out of there. Kane's men would be back, and they would bring more than 3 guns with them. He looked around. The townsfolk who had been watching from the shadows began to retreat further into their doorways, wanting no part of the fallout. There was no help to be found here. "We have to go," he said, his tone urgent. "They'll be back." He turned and strode toward the livery stable, his long legs eating up the ground. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just knew she would. There was nowhere else for her to go. Inside the stable, the smell of hay and horsehide was a small comfort, a connection to the man he had been just 10 minutes ago. He saddled his buckskin, Apollo, his movements efficient and practiced, a stark contrast to the chaos raging in his mind. Adzila appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the blinding sun. She stood silently, watching him. Her stillness was unsettling. Ilara had been a creature of constant motion, her energy filling every space. Adzila was the opposite, a pool of deep, quiet water. He finished with Apollo and turned to a sturdy-looking mare in the next stall. "Can you ride?" he asked, not looking at her. A simple nod was her reply. He saddled the mare and led both horses out into the alley behind the livery. "We'll head east, into the Badlands. It's rough country. They won't expect us to go that way." As they mounted up, Caleb couldn't help but steal another glance at her. The way she moved, with an economy of motion and an innate grace, was all her own. And yet, when she turned her head to look back at the town, the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, it was Ilara, a ghost in buckskin. He felt a surge of irrational anger, as if she were a specter sent to torment him. He dug his heels into Apollo's flanks and set a hard pace, forcing her to keep up. They rode for hours, the setting sun painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. The landscape shifted from scrubland to a labyrinth of canyons and mesas, the rock formations like ancient, sleeping beasts. The air grew cooler, but the silence between them was glacial. Caleb was lost in a canyon of his own making, every rock and shadow conspiring to twist Adzila's form into that of his wife. He'd hear the soft creak of her saddle and think it was Ilara riding beside him on a Sunday afternoon. He'd catch her scent on the wind, not Ilara's lavender soap, but something wilder, of sage and earth and smoke, and the difference was as jarring as the similarities. He was a man torn in two. The rancher who had sworn off violence was now a fugitive, a gun on his hip once more. The grieving husband who had enshrined his wife in memory was now riding alongside her living echo. He didn't know which betrayal felt worse. He had saved Adzila, but he was beginning to think he had damned himself. As darkness fell, deep and absolute, he finally called a halt. They found a small overhang, a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall that would offer some protection from the elements and prying eyes. He dismounted, his body stiff and sore. He set about building a small, smokeless fire, a skill he hadn't needed in years, but had never forgotten. Adzila slid from her horse and began to gather dried brush, moving with a quiet competence that needed no instruction. She worked without a word, her presence a constant, unnerving weight. When the fire was lit, casting flickering shadows against the rock, she sat on the other side, pulling a thin blanket from her saddle roll and wrapping it around her shoulders. Caleb watched the firelight play across her face, highlighting the contours that were so achingly familiar. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands. She was not a ghost. She was a woman, flesh and blood, who had been through a terrible ordeal. A sliver of guilt cut through his confusion. He had been so lost in his own past that he hadn't given a moment's thought to her present. "Why were they dragging you like that?" he asked, his voice rough, What do they want with you?" Adsila stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "A map," she said softly. "One that is not on paper. It is in my head. It leads to the sunstone of my ancestors." "Treasure?" She looked at him then, and her eyes held a weariness that went far beyond the day's events. "To your people, yes. To mine. It is a history, a spirit, something Silas Kane believes he can lock in a vault." Caleb fell silent, the weight of her words settling between them. He had rescued her from mercenaries, only to drag her into the wilderness, all while seeing her as a painful reminder of his own loss. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, trying to see Adsila, not Alara. He saw the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her gaze, the proud set of her shoulders despite the abuse she had suffered, and he felt a profound sense of shame. He had saved her life, but he hadn't even asked her name until he was forced to. He had been reacting to a memory, not to the woman in front of him. The temperature in the high desert plummeted as the last vestiges of twilight surrendered to a black, star-dusted sky. The small fire Caleb had built offered a circle of warmth no more than a few feet wide, a feeble bastion against the encroaching chill that seeped from the cold rock and sandy ground. Caleb sat with his back against the canyon wall, the rifle resting across his lap. Every snap of the fire, every skitter of a nocturnal creature, sent a jolt through him. He was a stranger in his own skin, the quiet rancher at war with the vigilant gunslinger he thought he had buried. Across the meager flames, Adsila shivered. The thin blanket she had was no match for the biting cold. She had drawn her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, to conserve what little warmth she had. Caleb watched her, his inner turmoil churning. Part of him, the part that was still Alara's husband, wanted to keep his distance, to treat her as a stranger he was honor-bound to protect, but nothing more. It felt like a betrayal to even acknowledge the ghost she wore as a face. But another part of him, the man Alara had loved, the good man she'd begged him to be, saw a woman in need. He had a thick wool bedroll, a staple of his life on the ranch. It was heavy, warm, and far more than he needed. The memory of Alara's final, shivering moments, her body failing to hold any heat, flashed through his mind with an icy clarity. He could not sit in warmth while another suffered the cold. Not again. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last 2 years, he stood up, unstrapped his bedroll, and walked around the fire. He stopped in front of her, the bedroll held in his hands. Adsila looked up, her whiskey-colored eyes wide and questioning in the firelight. She tensed, as if expecting a blow or a harsh word. The realization that she was still braced for cruelty sent a fresh pang of guilt through him. "You'll freeze with just that," he said, his voice low. "This is warmer." He held it out. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the thick wool and then back to his face. Trust was a currency she did not have to spend. He understood. He knelt, placing the bedroll on the ground beside her, then retreated back to his side of the fire, giving her space. He turned his attention to cleaning the rifle, a task to occupy his hands and his mind. He heard the rustle of movement and glanced up from beneath the brim of his hat. She had unrolled the bedroll and wrapped it around herself, over her own thin blanket. The immediate relief on her face was visible as the thick wool began to ward off the deep chill. She settled back against the rock wall, her shivering subsiding. She murmured something in her own language, a soft, musical sound that the fire almost swallowed. Then, in English, she said, "Thank you." "Don't mention it," Caleb replied gruffly, focusing on the rifle's mechanism. An hour passed in silence. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. Caleb felt the exhaustion of the day pressing down, his eyelids growing heavy. He knew he should stay awake, keep watch, but his body, unaccustomed to such a flight, was betraying him. His head nodded once, then twice. A soft sound brought him partially awake. Adsila was standing over him. Before he could react, she took the heavy rifle from his lap. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, his instincts screaming danger. Her skin was cool beneath his fingers. She didn't pull away. She simply stood there, her gaze calm and steady. "You are tired," she said softly. "Sleep. I will watch." He looked into her eyes, the firelight reflecting in their depths. They were Alara's eyes, but the expression in them was entirely her own. It was a look of quiet capability, of shared understanding. She had seen his exhaustion, and she was offering a truce, a moment of shared responsibility in this hostile wilderness. His grip on her wrist loosened, his fingers tracing the raw red groove the mercenary's rope had left behind. An apology rose in his throat, but he couldn't speak it. His touch softened from a grip to a cradle, his thumb gently stroking the damaged skin. It was a simple, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through him, an unexpected current of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a connection to the living, a feeling he had denied himself for 2 years. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes as well, a subtle widening that told him she felt it too. The space between them crackled with an unspoken emotion, not love, not desire, but a fragile, terrifying spark of recognition. A recognition that they were two wounded souls, trapped in the same cold darkness, sharing a moment of unexpected grace. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He had touched a ghost, and found her to be real. The shock of it was more profound than the initial reveal in the street. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet canyon. "All right," he conceded, his voice strained. "A few hours." He leaned his head back against the cold stone, pulling his hat down over his eyes. He didn't sleep. Not really. He drifted in a state of hyper-awareness, conscious of every move Adsila made. He heard her add wood to the fire. He felt her gaze on him, and he could still feel the phantom sensation of her skin against his, a fragile truce that threatened to thaw a heart he had long believed was frozen solid. Dawn broke over the canyon rim, a mercilessly beautiful spectacle of pink and gold that offered no warmth. Caleb awoke stiff and unrested, the memory of his hand on Adzila's wrist still tingling in his palm. She was already awake, sitting cross-legged and staring east as the sun rose, her posture as serene as a statue carved from the rock itself. The rifle rested beside her, and he knew she had kept her word and watched through the night. A fragile trust, born of necessity and a shared fire, had begun to sprout in the barren soil of their predicament. "We need to find water," he said, his voice a gravelly morning rasp. He stood and stretched, his joints protesting. Adsila rose without a word and pointed toward a narrow split in the canyon wall, a path almost invisible to an untrained eye. "There is a spring, 2 miles that way. A place the animals know." Caleb raised an eyebrow. Her knowledge of this unforgiving land was already proving to be an asset. "A shortcut. A surer path," she corrected gently. "The wide canyon is an easy place for an ambush. This way is harder, but safer." He nodded, conceding to her expertise. They ate a meager breakfast of dried jerky and packed their sparse camp. As they rode, following the winding game trail Adsila had indicated, Caleb found himself watching her. He was starting to see the small things that distinguished her from Alara. The way she sat her horse, with a natural balance that seemed to meld her to the animal. The way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reading the landscape like a book written in a language he barely understood. These were the skills of a survivor, honed by a life he couldn't begin to imagine. The ghost was receding, and in its place, Adsila was slowly, painstakingly, coming into focus. The trail was treacherous, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through narrow passages choked with thorny scrub brush and loose rock. They had just cleared a particularly dense thicket when Adsila suddenly froze, her hand shooting out to stop him. "What is it?" he whispered. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on a patch of sun-drenched rock just ahead. Caleb followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold. Coiled in the dust, almost perfectly camouflaged, was a diamond-back rattlesnake, its tail an ominous blur, its head raised, ready to strike. It was directly in their path. "Easy now," Caleb breathed, slowly reaching for the pistol at his hip. "I'll take care of it." "No," Adsila whispered, her voice tight. "The shot will echo for miles." She was right. It would be a dinner bell for Kane's men. She took a step back, pulling him with her, her eyes never leaving the snake. "We go around, slowly." She began to sidle along the rock face, her movements fluid and silent. Caleb followed, his hand still hovering over his gun. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the terrifying, incessant buzz of the snake's rattle. They were almost past it when Apollo, spooked by the sound, shied sideways. The horse's hoof dislodged a stone, which clattered down near the coiled reptile. In a flash of scaled fury, the snake struck. It didn't strike the horse. It didn't strike Caleb. It struck Adsila. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled back, her hand flying to her calf. Caleb didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and fired, the shot deafening in the narrow passage. The snake's head vanished in a spray of dust and blood. All thoughts of Silas Kane and his men evaporated, replaced by a singular, all-consuming fear. He rushed to her side as she sank to the ground, her face pale. 2 small, dark puncture wounds were already welling with blood on her lower leg, just above her moccasin. The venom was already in her system. "No, no, no," Caleb muttered, his mind reeling. He saw Alara again, not in Adsila's face, but in the situation. Another person he was helpless to save. Another life slipping away in his hands. The panic was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing his chest. But then he looked into Adsila's eyes. They were wide with pain, but not with terror. They were steady. They were looking at him, relying on him. That look cut through the fog of his grief. This was not Alara. This was Adsila, and she was alive. "All right," he said, his voice shaking but firm. He forced himself to recall the old frontier remedies, the things his father had taught him. He pulled a knife from his belt. "This is going to hurt." She just nodded, her jaw tight. He made 2 small, quick cuts over the fang marks, creating an X to encourage bleeding. He then pressed his lips to the wound, sucking and spitting, trying to draw out as much of the poison as he could. The metallic taste of her blood filled his mouth. He did it again and again, his panic giving way to a desperate, focused resolve. He would not lose her. He would not stand by and watch death win again. When he could do no more, he tore a strip from his own shirt and tightly bound her leg above the wound to slow the venom's spread. He lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but her body was already beginning to tremble with fever. "The spring," she whispered, her voice faint. "There are herbs there. Chewed root." He didn't need any more encouragement. Cradling her in one arm and holding the reins of both horses in his other hand, he began to move, half running, half stumbling through the rocky terrain. The fear he felt was a familiar agony, the same crushing fear he'd felt as Alara faded, But this time, it was different. It wasn't the resigned grief of watching the inevitable. It was the fierce, desperate terror of a man who realized, with shocking clarity, that he had something to lose again. Caleb pushed through the last of the rocks and into a small, hidden oasis. A thin trickle of water seeped from the canyon wall, pooling in a basin of smooth stone before disappearing back into the sand. Greenery, vibrant and defiant, clung to the damp rock. He gently laid Adsila down in the shade, her body racked with tremors, her skin hot to the touch. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes, when they opened, were unfocused and clouded with pain. "The root," she mumbled, her fingers weakly gesturing toward a tough-looking plant with broad, waxy leaves growing near the water's edge. "Yellow flower. Helps with snake venom." Caleb found the plant and dug at its base with his knife, unearthing a thick, gnarled root. He did as she instructed, chewing a piece of the fibrous root into a wet poultice and applying it to the wound, then wrapping it with a fresh strip of cloth. He used his canteen to dribble water onto her parched lips. His hands, calloused and rough from ranch work, now surprisingly gentle. For the rest of the day and into the long, tense night, he was her keeper. He kept the fever down with cool, damp cloths. He fed her sips of water and a thin broth made from the last of his jerky. He sat by her side, watching the poison and the antidote wage war within her. In her delirium, she spoke, not in English, but in the flowing, rhythmic cadence of her Comanche tongue. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. There was pain, sorrow, and a name that she repeated like a prayer. Pia. Sometime near dawn, the fever broke, her trembling ceased, and her breathing deepened into the slow, regular rhythm of true sleep. Caleb slumped against the rock wall, relief so profound it left him weak and hollowed out. He had not failed. She was alive. 2 days passed in the sanctuary of the spring. Adsila's strength slowly returned. The swelling in her leg began to subside, and the color returned to her face. The enforced stillness created a new kind of intimacy between them. He would help her walk a few steps, his arm securely around her waist. She would redress her own wound, but would allow him to check the poultice. They talked, not about the treasure or the men hunting them, but about small things. He told her about his ranch, about his favorite horse, Apollo. She told him about the constellations her people saw in the night sky, different from the ones he knew. The ghost of Alara had not vanished, but it no longer stood between them. When he looked at Adsila now, he saw her. He saw her resilience, her quiet humor, her fierce will to live. A fragile trust, forged in shared hardship, was blossoming into something deeper, something that cautiously resembled hope. On the third evening, as they sat by the fire, the atmosphere felt different. The tension was gone, replaced by a comfortable silence. Caleb found himself wanting to know more about the woman who had so unexpectedly crashed into his life. "The name you said," he began softly, "when you had the fever. Pia. Who was she?" Adsila's face tightened, the brief peace vanishing from her eyes. She stared into the fire, and he knew he had touched a wound as raw as the snakebite. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. "She was my daughter," Adsila said finally, her voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy and devastating. Caleb's heart clenched. He knew the pain of loss, but the loss of a child was a grief he couldn't fathom. I'm sorry." "She died last winter," Adsila continued, her voice flat, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "The coughing sickness took many of our children. There was no medicine. The traders who came to our lands wanted too many furs, more than we could give. They had what we needed. We had nothing they valued. She paused, taking a shaky breath. So I left. I went to find something they would value, something to trade for the lives of the next children who fall ill. The Sunstone, Caleb breathed, understanding dawning. She wasn't a treasure hunter. She was a mother trying to save her people. Yes. She looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a desperate, heartbreaking sincerity. Caleb, there is something you need to know. Before this, I had to survive. I did things I am not proud of. He waited, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. To learn the ways of the white men, to understand the world outside my village. I worked for a time, as a scout, a tracker. She took another breath, and the next words came out in a rush. The man I worked for, he led a band of outlaws. They were called the Black Creek Gang. The name hit Caleb like a physical blow. The Black Creek Gang. The same men who had raided his ranch 2 years ago. The men he had fought. The men who had killed Alara. The air was sucked from his lungs. The fragile world he had just started to build with this woman crumbled into dust. You were with them, he managed to say, his voice cold and unrecognizable. I was their tracker. Yes, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I led them through the territories. But I did not know what they planned at your ranch. I was not there that day. I swear it. When I heard what they did, I left. I ran. That is when I returned to my people. That is when I lost Pia. I am not one of them. Caleb. But Caleb couldn't hear her. He could only hear the gunshots from that terrible night. He could only see Alara's face. And now, that face was superimposed onto Adsila's, no longer a haunting resemblance, but a mark of betrayal. She had been part of it, part of the chain of events that had destroyed his life. The warmth he had begun to feel for her turned to ice. The trust, so carefully nurtured, shattered into a million pieces. He stood up abruptly, his face a mask of stone. He walked to the edge of the firelight and stood with his back to her, looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the canyon. Get some rest, he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. We ride at first light. The connection between them was severed. The fragile blossom of hope had been crushed under the weight of a bitter, unforgivable truth. The dawn that followed Adsila's confession was cold and gray. The sky a sheet of slate. The easy silence that had grown between them was gone, replaced by a chasm of unspoken accusations and raw pain. Caleb moved with a rigid, mechanical efficiency, avoiding her gaze, his face set in a grim, unforgiving line. Every time he looked at her, he no longer saw a survivor or a grieving mother. He saw a collaborator, an extension of the gang that had ripped his world apart. His anger was a cold, hard knot in his gut, a chilling fury that was far more terrifying than the hot rage he had once known. Adsila watched him, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had known telling him the truth was a risk, but she had underestimated the depth of his wound. She had hoped he would see the distinction, that being a part of the gang to survive was different from being one of them in spirit. But in his eyes, she was tainted, her past an indelible stain. His silence was a wall she could not breach, his coldness a punishment more cutting than any blow. She had offered him the truth, a piece of her broken soul, and he had rejected it utterly. They rode out of the small oasis and back into the exposed badlands. Caleb pushed the pace relentlessly, his jaw tight. He no longer consulted her on the path, choosing instead to follow the main canyon, the very route she had warned him against. It was a reckless, deliberate rebuke of her knowledge, of the trust they had briefly shared. Adsila followed without protest, her own pain a silent companion. She understood his anger. She had lived with her own shame for so long, a constant, bitter companion. By midday, the sky began to change. The gray slate darkened to a bruised purple, and the wind, which had been a gentle breeze, began to whip through the canyon, picking up sand and grit. It howled with a rising, mournful voice. Adsila tasted the change in the air, a dry, electric quality that spoke of a coming storm. "Caleb," she called out over the rising wind. "A storm is coming. A bad one. We need to find shelter." He didn't look back, his shoulders rigid. "We keep moving." "You don't understand," she urged, pushing her horse to ride alongside his. "This is not just wind. It's a sandstorm. It will strip the flesh from your bones. There is a series of caves a mile north of here. We can make it if we hurry." Her urgency finally seemed to penetrate his wall of anger. He scanned the ominous sky, the horizon already a blurry, yellow-brown haze. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. He still wouldn't look at her. But he turned his horse, following her as she veered off the main path and toward a ridge of weathered rock. They were too late. The storm hit them with the force of a physical blow. The world dissolved into a roaring, suffocating vortex of sand. Visibility dropped to near zero. The sun was blotted out. The wind shrieked, a primal scream that tore at them, trying to rip them from their saddles. Sand blasted their exposed skin, 1,000 stinging needles. "The caves! This way!" Adsila screamed, pointing toward a dark gash in the rock face that was barely visible through the swirling chaos. They half rode, half stumbled the last few yards, pushing their terrified horses before them into the relative calm of the cave mouth. They collapsed just inside the entrance, gasping for air, their lungs burning, their eyes and mouths full of grit. The roar of the storm outside was slightly muffled, but its power was immense, a terrifying reminder of the indifferent cruelty of nature. The cave was not large, barely a hollow in the rock, forcing them into a suffocating proximity. They were just feet apart, the space between them charged with a tense, volatile energy. Outside, the world was being scoured clean. Inside, they were trapped in an emotional crucible. Caleb leaned against the far wall, his hat pulled low, his face a mask of grim fury. Adsila huddled near the entrance, watching the terrifying beauty of the sandstorm, a maelstrom that mirrored the one inside her own heart. For hours, they sat in silence, the only sound the howling of the wind. The intimacy was unbearable. Caleb was trapped with the woman he now saw as a symbol of his greatest loss. Adsila was trapped with the man whose forgiveness she craved, but knew she might never receive. He was wrestling with his memories of Alara, with the vow he had broken, with a hatred he thought he'd left behind. She was wrestling with her guilt, with her choices made for survival, and with the terrifying realization that this stranger's judgment of her mattered more than it should. The air grew thick with everything left unsaid. It was a prison of their own making, a storm within a storm, and neither of them knew if they would survive it intact. The sandstorm raged for the better part of a day before its fury finally abated, the shrieking wind softening to a weary sigh. A strange orange twilight filtered into the cave as the dense clouds of sand began to settle. The world outside was transformed, the landscape smoothed and reshaped, landmarks buried under new dunes of fine sand. It was a world wiped clean, a stark contrast to the unresolved turmoil within the cave. Caleb was the first to move, his body stiff from the long, tense vigil. He pushed himself off the wall, his face still a hard, unreadable mask. "We've lost time," he said, his voice raspy from the grit and disuse. He walked to the cave entrance, peering out at the altered terrain. The anger hadn't left him. It had simply settled. From a raging fire to cold, Hard embers. Adsila watched him, a knot of dread in her stomach. His recklessness before the storm had shaken her. His anger was making him careless. And in this land, carelessness was a death sentence. As he stepped out of the cave to check on the horses, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On a high ridge, less than half a mile away, the setting sun glinted off something metallic, a rifle scope. They hadn't been buried by the storm. They had been patient. They had been waiting. "Caleb, get back!" she hissed, her voice sharp with urgency. But he was already in the open, his focus on the horses. Before he could react to her warning, the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon. It wasn't aimed at him. The bullet slammed into the rock wall just above the cave entrance, spraying stone chips. A warning shot, a trap being sprung. From behind a cluster of rocks to their left, 3 of Silas Kane's men emerged, rifles leveled. Simultaneously, the sniper on the ridge stood up, his silhouette a dark omen against the dying light. They were pinned down, caught in a crossfire. "Well, look what the storm blew in," one of the men sneered. The same one with the scarred eyebrow Caleb had dealt with in town. His head was bandaged, and his eyes burned with malice. "Mr. Kane wants the girl. He said you could be left for the buzzards. Rancher. Last chance to walk away." Caleb drew his pistol, his body instinctively moving to shield the cave entrance where Adsila stood. His cold anger had been instantly vaporized, replaced by the hot, clear focus of a fight for survival. But he knew their position was hopeless. "Go," he muttered to Adsila under his breath. "Get to the back of the cave." "No," she said, her eyes scanning their attackers' positions. She wasn't looking at them as a victim, but as a strategist. "They are using a classic pincer formation. The sniper keeps us pinned while the others advance. It's how the Black Creek gang used to work." The mention of the gang sent a jolt through Caleb, but there was no time for anger. He saw the truth in her words. She knew their tactics. She knew how they thought. "The sniper is the key," she whispered urgently. "He thinks he's safe up there. But there's a wash, a dry riverbed, that runs behind that ridge. The storm would have hidden our tracks. If you can circle around through it, you can get behind him. I will keep them occupied." "Keep them occupied? With what?" he shot back. "They'll kill you." "They want me alive," she reminded him, her gaze intense and unwavering. "That is my shield. You are the one they want dead. Now go." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his mind warring with itself. Trusting her went against every fiber of his being, against the fresh wound of her betrayal. But looking at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, he knew she was right. Her plan, born from the very past that stood between them, was their only chance. He gave a single, sharp nod, while he slipped back into the shadows of the cave, looking for a rear exit. Adsila stepped boldly out into the open, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I will come with you," she called out, her voice steady. "But you must promise to let him go. He's just a rancher who made a mistake." The scarred man laughed. "We ain't promising nothing." But her move had worked. Their attention was now fully on her. They advanced slowly, cautiously, their rifles still trained on her. They saw her as the prize, the unarmed woman. They didn't see the silent shadow detaching from the back of the cave, disappearing into the newly formed dunes of the wash. Caleb moved with a speed and stealth he hadn't used in years. His heart pounded, not with fear for himself, but for her. He was trusting his life, and hers, to her knowledge of his wife's killers. The irony was a bitter pill. He scrambled up the loose rock of the ridge, the sniper's perch just feet above him. He could hear Adsila's voice, calm and measured, drawing the mercenary's focus. He pulled himself over the ledge, his pistol ready. The sniper was prone, his eye to his scope, completely focused on the scene below. He never heard Caleb approach. Caleb brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the man's head. The sniper crumpled without a sound. Now for the others. From his new vantage point, Caleb had a clear line of sight. He fired twice. The first shot took one of the advancing men in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second kicked up dust at the feet of the scarred man, forcing him to dive for cover. The element of surprise was total. They were now the ones caught in a crossfire. Down below. Adsila had already reacted. The moment the first shot rang out from the ridge, she dropped to the ground and scrambled for a loose rock, hurling it with surprising force and accuracy, catching the third man in the face. He staggered back, giving Caleb the opening he needed. Another shot from the ridge, and the man fell. The scarred man, realizing the tables had turned, fired a few wild shots toward the ridge before turning to run, dragging his wounded companion with him. Caleb let them go. The message had been sent. He scrambled back down the ridge and ran toward the cave. Adsila was already on her feet, her chest heaving, her eyes searching for him in the twilight. When she saw him, safe, a wave of relief so powerful it was visible washed over her face. He stopped a few feet from her, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. She had saved him. Her cursed past, the source of all the bitterness between them, had been their salvation. The words wouldn't come. There was nothing he could say to bridge the gap her confession had created. But actions spoke louder. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her tightly. It wasn't a hug of passion, but of desperation, of gratitude, of a profound and shattering recognition. She was stiff with surprise for a moment. Then she melted against him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, her face buried in his shoulder. The wall of ice between them had finally, irrevocably, cracked. In the quiet aftermath of the ambush, the setting sun bled its last colors across the horizon, casting long purple shadows that softened the harsh edges of the Badlands. The air was cool and still, the scent of gunpowder faintly mingling with the clean smell of rain-washed dust. Caleb and Adsila stood apart now, the desperate embrace having given way to a fragile, uncertain space between them. The violence had broken the stalemate, forcing a reckoning that silence could no longer postpone. Caleb finally broke the quiet, his voice low and heavy with contrition. "You saved my life. Your plan." He trailed off. The rest of the sentence, "Your knowledge of their ways," hanging unspoken in the air. "We saved each other," Adsila replied, her gaze fixed on the darkening landscape. She hugged her arms around herself, a protective gesture. "I owed you that." "You owed me nothing," he said, and the words were a surrender. "I was a fool, blinded by the past." He finally said it, the admission costing him a visible effort. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he wasn't just seeing the woman who wore his wife's face or the woman who had ties to his wife's killers. He was seeing the woman who had stood defiant in the face of her captors, who had calmly assessed a battlefield, who had trusted him to do his part. He walked over to the small fire they had rekindled and added a piece of dried mesquite. "When I saw you in that street," he began, staring into the flames, "I felt like I was losing my mind. You look so much like her. It was like a ghost had stepped out of my memory. For these past 2 years, I've been living with that ghost, talking to her, making promises to her. And then you appeared, and I think I was angry at you for not being her, and then I was angry at you for being a part of what took her from me." He finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. "I haven't been seeing you at all, Adsila, just a reflection of my own grief. I'm sorry." Tears welled in Adsila's eyes, but she did not let them fall. His apology was a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was so deep. "And I have been afraid," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I was afraid that if you ever looked at me with kindness, it was only because you saw her, that I could never be anything more to you than a shadow she cast." The truth of their mutual fears was finally laid bare between them, stark and undeniable in the firelight. He saw a woman haunted by her choices, and she saw a man haunted by his loss. They were both trapped, not by Silas Kane, but by the ghosts they carried. "My daughter, Pia," Adsila said softly. "She had my smile, but she had her father's eyes. When she was gone, for a time, I could not look at her father without feeling the pain of my loss all over again. I understand what it is to be reminded." She took a step closer to him. "But you are not just a husband in mourning, Caleb, and I am not just a reflection of your wife. I am a Comanche woman who tracked for killers to survive, and a mother who would do anything to protect her people. That is my truth. All of it." Caleb listened, and the last of the cold anger in his heart finally melted away, replaced by a profound and humbling empathy. He had been so consumed by his own pain that he had failed to see hers. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket, tarnished with age. He opened it, revealing a tiny, faded portrait of Alara. He had looked at it every night for 2 years. "She was my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and she will always be a part of me. But she is gone." He closed the locket with a soft click. He didn't put it back in his pocket. Instead, he walked to his saddlebags and carefully placed it inside, burying it beneath his spare clothes. It was a small gesture, but it was a seismic shift. He was not letting go of the memory, but he was putting it in its proper place. He was choosing to live in the present. He returned to the fire, to her. The space between them was no longer an empty chasm, but a quiet ground where something new could potentially be built. "Adsila," he said, testing her name on his tongue, letting it be its own word, free of echoes. "The Sunstone. We will get it back. Together." It wasn't a promise of love or a guarantee of a future. It was something simpler, and perhaps more important. It was a promise of partnership, acknowledging her fight as his own. She looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, tentative smile, but it was genuine, and it was entirely her own. In the heart of the unforgiving wilderness, 2 scarred souls had finally chosen to see each other, not as reflections of the past, but for who they truly were. Following Adsila's lead, they traveled for 2 more days, pushing deeper into the ancestral lands of the Comanche. The landscape grew wilder and more majestic, the red rock formations soaring into spires and arches that seemed to defy gravity. Adsila moved with a newfound confidence, her knowledge of the terrain not just a tool for survival, but a source of visible pride. She pointed out ancient petroglyphs carved into canyon walls, telling Caleb the stories they depicted, of great hunts, of spirits, of the history of her people. Caleb listened, absorbing it all, seeing the land through her eyes. The journey became less of a flight and more of a pilgrimage. The ghost of Alara no longer walked between them. Instead, it felt as though the spirits of Adsila's ancestors were guiding their steps. "We are close," she said one afternoon, reining in her horse at the edge of a high mesa. She pointed toward a deep, circular canyon, a massive bowl carved into the earth. At its center stood a single, towering rock spire, shaped by millennia of wind and water. "The Temple of the Sun is there." The entrance is hidden at the base of the spire. As they began their careful descent into the canyon, an unnatural stillness settled over the landscape. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent. There was no birdsong, no chatter of rock squirrels. A sense of being watched prickled at the back of Caleb's neck. "They're here," he said, his voice a low murmur. Adsila nodded, her face grim. "I feel it, too." They had hoped to arrive ahead of Kane's men, but the storm and the ambush had cost them too much time. Kane hadn't sent his men to chase them, he had sent them to the destination. They were walking into a trap. They left the horses tied in a hidden alcove and proceeded on foot, moving from shadow to shadow, the silence amplifying the sound of their own heartbeats. Adsila led Caleb to a fissure in the rock at the base of the central spire, an opening so narrow and concealed by overgrown brush that he would have walked past it 100 times. "The entrance," she whispered. Inside, a tunnel sloped gently downward, opening into a vast circular chamber. The air was cool and still, high above. A natural opening in the cavern ceiling allowed a single, brilliant shaft of sunlight to pierce the gloom, illuminating the center of the room. And in that beam of light, resting on a stone pedestal, was the sunstone. It wasn't a cut gem, but a large, smooth disk of unblemished obsidian, so dark and polished it seemed to drink the light itself. Its surface was carved with a complex spiral pattern that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was beautiful, ancient, and sacred. But they were not alone. Standing in the shadows around the chamber's edge were Silas Kane and a half-dozen of his men. The scarred mercenary was among them, his arm in a sling, his eyes burning with hatred. "Adsila, Caleb, how good of you to join us," Silas Kane said, stepping forward. He was a man whose expensive suit and polished boots were an obscenity in this sacred place. His smile was a bloodless slash in his pale face. "I must confess, we were having a bit of trouble finding the door. Thank you for showing us the way." Caleb's hand moved to his pistol, but Kane just chuckled. Ah, let's not be hasty. You are outnumbered, outgunned, and standing in what is about to become your tomb." "This is a sacred place, Kane," Adsila said, her voice ringing with a cold fury. "You defile it with your presence." "It's a bank vault, my dear, and you've just given me the key," he retorted. He gestured to 2 of his men. "Take the stone. Kill them." As the men moved toward the pedestal, Caleb knew that this was it. There was no escape. This was a fight to the death. He and Adsila exchanged a look. It was a look of grim understanding, of shared resolve. They had come this far together. They would face the end together. Caleb shoved Adsila toward the cover of a fallen pillar and opened fire. His first shot sent one of Kane's men sprawling. The chamber erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire, bullets ricocheting off the ancient stone walls, chipping away at carvings that had stood for centuries. Adsila, unarmed, was not helpless. She grabbed a loose rock and hurled it at the man reaching for the sunstone, striking him in the head and giving Caleb a precious second to aim and fire again. The fight was brutal and chaotic. It was 2 against 8. Impossible odds. Caleb fought with a ferocity he hadn't felt since the night Alara died. But this time, it wasn't driven by rage or revenge. It was for the woman beside him, for the sacred place they were defending. He moved, fired, and took cover, a deadly dance he knew all too well. A bullet grazed his arm, a hot, searing pain, but he ignored it. Adsila used her knowledge of the chamber to her advantage, disappearing into the shadows, creating diversions. Her shouted warnings in Comanche helping Caleb anticipate the gunmen's movements. She was a warrior defending her home. She toppled an unstable stack of rocks, sending them crashing down on one of the mercenaries, buying Caleb more time. They fought back to back, a seamless unit forged in fire and forgiveness. The odds began to even as Kane's men fell one by one, but they were running out of ammunition and time. Silas Kane, who had stayed out of the fight, now drew a polished revolver, his cold eyes fixed on Caleb. As Caleb reloaded, the scarred man, his good arm holding a knife, charged from his blind spot. "Caleb!" Adzilla screamed. Caleb turned, but he was too slow. The knife flashed. This was the end. But in that instant, Adzilla launched herself at the man, a desperate, self-sacrificing act. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the knife clattering across the stone floor. Caleb fired, and the scarred man went still. But Kane now had his shot. He aimed his revolver, not at Caleb, but at Adzilla, who was struggling to her feet. "The stone isn't worth as much as the satisfaction of this." Kane sneered. There was no time to think. Caleb threw himself in front of Adzilla, his body shielding hers, as the gun roared. The bullet slammed into Caleb's shoulder, the impact spinning him around and throwing him to the stone floor. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded through him. He gasped, his vision swimming, the echoes of the gunshot thundering in the sacred chamber. He could hear Adzilla cry his name, her voice filled with anguish. Through a haze of pain, he saw Silas Kane's smile, a triumphant, cruel expression as he leveled his pistol for the killing shot. But Kane had made a fatal error. In focusing on Caleb, he had forgotten the chamber itself. Behind him, Adzilla, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and fury, shoved with all her might against a massive, precariously balanced rocking stone, one of the ancient defenses of the temple her elders had spoken of. The multi-ton boulder teetered for a heart-stopping second before toppling from its perch with a deafening groan. Kane's eyes widened in disbelief, his triumphant smile turning to one of pure terror. He had no time to even scream before the rock crashed down, crushing him where he stood. A cloud of ancient dust filled the air, and then silence. The silence was absolute, broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing and the soft drip of water from the cavern ceiling. It was over. The mercenaries were dead. Kane was gone. The sunstone sat untouched on its pedestal, gleaming in the single shaft of light. Adzilla scrambled to Caleb's side, her hands hovering over his wound, her face a mask of fear. "Caleb, stay with me." "Just a scratch," he grunted, the lie tasting like blood in his mouth. The world was tilting, the edges of his vision going dark. "Liar," she whispered, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. She tore a long strip from the hem of her buckskin dress and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound, her touch both firm and gentle. "You saved my life. You took the bullet meant for me." "Seemed like my turn," he managed, a weak smile touching his lips. He looked from her face, so full of life and fear for him, to the obsidian disc on the pedestal. "You did it, Adzilla. You saved the sunstone." She followed his gaze, and her expression changed. The fear was still there, but it was joined by a profound sense of sorrow and resolve. "This is not a treasure to be traded," she said softly, as if speaking to her ancestors. "It is a heart, and it does not belong in the white man's world. Its power is for our people, to remind them of who they are. There are other ways to get medicine, ways that do not involve selling our soul." In that moment, Caleb understood. The journey had not been about retrieving a valuable object. It had been about Adzilla reclaiming her own strength, her own heritage, and it had been about him finding a reason to live beyond a memory. With Adzilla's help, he struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on her. Together, they limped toward the chamber's entrance, leaving the bodies of Cain and his men to the judgment of the spirits they had desecrated. They did not look back at the sunstone. Its purpose had been served. The journey back was a slow, arduous haze of pain for Caleb. Adsila was his strength, his guide, his healer. She tended his wound with chewed herbs and clean water. She hunted small game for them to eat. She led him and the horses through the wilderness, her presence a constant, reassuring warmth at his side. During the cold nights, she sat with him, sharing her blanket, holding his hand when the pain and fever were at their worst. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. In the crucible of the temple, their separate pasts of grief and guilt had been burned away, leaving a bond forged in shared sacrifice and a deep, unspoken love. Weeks later, they crested a familiar ridge, and Caleb saw his ranch nestled in the valley below. It looked the same, yet everything was different. It was no longer a monument to a life that was over. It was a place of new beginnings. He turned to Adsila, who sat on her horse beside him, her face calm as she looked at his home. "This isn't much," he said, his voice quiet. "It is a place of peace," she replied. "Peace is worth more than any stone." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, her fingers laced with his, a perfect fit. He no longer saw a ghost when he looked at her. He saw a sunrise. He saw his future. And for the first time in 2 long years, as they rode down into the valley together, Caleb Thorne was truly home. The West doesn't measure a person by the life they led, but by the choices they make when that life is shattered. It's a land that understands the nature of scars, knowing that they are not just marks of injury, but maps of survival. Caleb Thorne was a man defined by a grave, and Adsila was a woman defined by the mistakes she made to stay alive. They were 2 broken halves of 2 different worlds, drawn together by the echo of a face, and bound together by the choice to see beyond it. Their story is not one of a treasure found, but of a treasure relinquished. They learned that the past is a place of reference, not a place of residence. True redemption isn't about erasing what you've done. It's about forging a better future from the pieces of who you are. In the quiet resilience of their shared life, in the space between a haunted man and a hunted woman, they discovered a love that was not a replacement for what was lost, but a new and stronger thing, nurtured in the harshest of soils. They found that the most sacred ground isn't a hidden temple, but the space one builds for another in a wounded heart.